the first game, which is a pretty big DreamWorks IP called Real Steel, is going live tonight on our platform. This game is a 6 million install iOS and Android game, which was a single player game, very successful over the last year and a half. And the team really needed to move it forward and make it into something which is the range of the season today, multiplayer. And they chose our platform at the end of January, and in about 10 weeks of development, they were able to finish and launch this game very tonight. So, I believe there are about 10,000 studios. People say there are a bit more, a bit less, but there are operationally 10,000 studios. This is the list and a map from Game Dev Map. And all of them aspire to be, the next big studio, a Zynga or a Superset, better name. But there's great passion in what we do and what every studio developer wants to do, what they want to achieve. But very few get there. Right? So what is it that's different about these two companies? Just as examples, there are others as well. But what's different about them is that they realized pretty early on in their life cycle that multiplayer always wins. It started off with a simple game like Words with Friends, right? Hanging with Friends, the new toy set of games which were released in 2009. And they proved something very important. People like to play with friends, right? They don't want to play alone. So very quickly, Scrabble, Uno, which are living room games for every one of us for decades, went online and were hugely successful. And then innovation started off from there. So Draw Something was probably the first big game which was asynchronous, which actually made people play against each other, take turns at it, and win streaks, right? So which was where the retention mechanism started to come alive, right? Previously it was all about lobbies and saying how many people are in the lobby right now. So that was the scale of your multiplayer game. But with asynchronous games, particularly Draw Something, it showed that millions of people could be playing the same game, but in a disconnected mode, turns which are spread over time, over hours, over days, but still retain that interest and that engagement with that game. Right? That's what is powerful about multiplayer games. Zynga Poker has been a huge success right from day one. Clash of Clans last August, it launched, and this last month it has done 2.5 million a day. Well, that's the revenue it's making right now. All because of this retention mechanism. So why do these games succeed? They succeed because, like I said, we expect to play with our friends. And second, because they have much higher retention. Higher retention means higher monetization. That happens because I want to get ahead of my friends. Right? I want to have the best possible castle, the best possible sword, right? Or the most number of gems, or have the fanciest farm, or whatever you want to do with it, right? But eventually, this is made possible by just one thing, which is friends, which leads to cheaper user acquisition. Right? In every other game, you're buying every single user. Right? You end up spending maybe $25,000 on day one to get just your initial critical mass, so that word of mouth can get word. That's single player games for you. Right? Multiplayer needs less. That's because you are including mechanics which require users to bring in their friends into the games. Right? You use social graphs like Facebook, maybe Google Plus, maybe tomorrow a platform like KakaoTalk. Have you heard of it? Any of you? It's one of the most popular instant messaging apps right now in Asia. It's like WhatsApp, if you're using WhatsApp, and it's got huge number of users, and they're integrating games into that social graph. Today, studios from Asia are talking about integrating KakaoTalk as a social graph before Facebook, particularly for mobile. Because that's where that graph makes more sense. Right? But there's right now a very few of these games. And that's because there is platform diversity. You've got iOS, Android, you've got the web, maybe you'll choose HTML5 or Flash or something else, whatever it is. But there's Windows 8 coming up, there is possibly Mozilla coming up on the mobile, so there is constantly going to be platform diversity. And that makes your job more complex. How many builds are you going to make? Which markets are you going to target? And each one has their own complexities. Right? Second is that most of the studios have been so focused and so passionate about graphics and the front end and the physics engines and the OEM SDKs that they've never built the skill sets on the back end. Right? This is a gap which needs to be filled. It needs to be filled quickly. You have a lot of people who can build great backends, right? There's people who work on Facebook, people who work on a number of great properties on the web, but that's not games. And game developers don't have backend teams. That's the gap. Resultantly, multiplayer development costs 3 to 4 times that of single player games. That's because you have completely new skill sets, you've got more integration between the front end and the back end as you build your backend stack, which leads to higher cost. New resources are required, more time is required, more iterations are required. And finally, multiplayer games begin life at launch. For a single player game, life practically ends there. Right? You've put it up, it's out there, right? It's going to make it or break it. But multiplayer games, you've got to, keep them in your house till they're ready. Right? So that's the difference. Right? So, but I believe that a couple of years from now, we're going to see a couple of hundred studios making multiplayer games. Right? Not just 3 or 4 of them. Right? We're going to see 5 games in the top 1,000. Half of them being multiplayer in some way. Right? And that will result into traffic of maybe a billion a week. Right? Just on multiplayer. And that's the future, because we want to play with friends. So let's explore some of the development processes that we follow for this. I would like to start with a few questions to just figure out who's doing what and where do you fall into this development stage. How many of you have already done a multiplayer game? Great. Oh, wow. Well, that's about 20%. Okay. Was it asynchronous? Synchronous?
Asynchronous. Raise your hand.
Asynchronous? Async? Oh, you already know why these games work. So, synchronous generally have been targeted to PCs or consoles which are Wi-Fi connected in some way, better bandwidth, right, to play. Not so much easy to do on mobile because bandwidth can be pretty tricky on mobile. Asynchronous works better there. So this is how a single player game development cycle looks like. It's pretty simple, neat, clean, tidy. We all know how it works. You work on the concept, build a GDD around it. Once it's gone through those iterations, then obviously you start building your raw assets, graphics, and you start programming the front end. You chose a new platform, maybe you pick up a tool like Unity or something else. And then once you've done that, you get reporting, right? For the different markets, for the market-specific complexities. In-app purchases are different in Android from iOS. Push notifications work differently. And so all of those things is what you start tuning up in your builds. And then you launch it, right? That's your teenager going out the door. Finished. No more responsibility. But this is how multiplayer game development works. So, you start off and do everything that you've done with the single player game right after here. But this is where you start realizing that your front-end code is often without a backend. You've got to start building a whole new stack of backend services. Right? You need, very simple, you want to store your user on the backend because he's going to connect with the social graph, he's going to bring in his friends. You need to store that whole friend list. Mine is about 1,000 people. How about yours? So it can be really huge.
7,000
data. 7,000 data. We don't want to play games. Not on my server.
Why? You're saying my friends aren't good enough?
No, I don't mean that. I think you've got too many friends.
There's no such thing!
So anyway, coming back to server-side development, all of these different things stack up, right? So you've got to do really good user management. You've got to know where is your users coming from. Not just which part of the world, what IP address, but what device is he using? What network is he coming from? Right? What version of the operating system is he using? That's one new one. right? So it isn't enough to know that he's on iOS. You need to figure out whether he's using iOS 4X or new 5X or Retina versus standard resolution. And you're going to have different builds for them, right? So there's a lot of stuff that you need to keep about a user, right? Then you need to build, let's say you're building a turn management game, or a turn-based game. So you need to store what's going to be passed along in every single turn. You've got to build your server-side logic for your game-specific needs. Let's say you're doing poker. So you've got the entire logic for dealing out cards. You've got the entire logic for analyzing hands, whether who's got a better hand. So who wins, you've got to decide on the server side. You can no longer do that in your client application, right? And every time you distribute cards out, right, you need to run timers. So that everybody's got a finite time, right? So you need a universal clock, which is running across multiple time zones, multiple kinds of devices. So you can't use the device time. You've got to have a server time. You need a big Ben backing you up, right? And all of these services are very critical. You cannot start the front-end development without these basic services being already present. So your server-side team has to start building the server in line with your graphics. Even if your assets are completed, you've got to have the server parts ready. Once you go from there, you have done this development and you start integrating it. Then you get to porting. Porting becomes a lot easier because now you're only handling UI stuff on the front end and the rest of the back end is common. But it is not, because every OEM and every SDK has its own complexities, right? And nowadays it's fashionable to work with 25 SDKs. And say, okay, I have 25 SDKs with an install size of maybe 10 MB, and my game is worth what? 7 MB. So you've got a huge game with 25 SDKs integrated. You don't need to do that. Maybe you'll work smarter. You'll build your own stack or use a better stack. And then you launch. But that's not enough. That's where you need to start understanding that your game has an economy inside it. And today, games are freemium. They depend completely on that economy. They depend upon a balance of that economy. It works pretty much like the real economy, right? So every game developer, particularly a multiplayer one, has to be a great economist as well, right? You've got to run your own country, right? Very few people get to do that. And that's the fun of making games, right? So that's very, very important. Now that's something which you need to be able to tweak. It's not something which you can bundle into your client application and ship it and update it once in 6 months. It's got to be something which you tune on a daily basis. See what users are doing, what they're buying, introduce new items. And all of these things mean that you need much greater flexibility on the server side, a lot greater control. And your client has to be flexible enough to be able to realize that yes, there is something else which that's me, right? And I'm not the end thing. All of this runs on some pretty amazing infrastructure. You cannot put in a desktop and expect it to run for users. To make a great game, let's say you've got 1 million users in the first 15 days. Draw something did, what, 32 million in the first 15 days? If that were to happen to your next game, how would you scale it? So there's no physical infrastructure which can take this kind of scale. You need to be in the cloud. Right? And that has its own challenges. So how many of you have worked with any of the cloud service providers? Amazon? Azure? Which one?
Amazon.
Great. That seems to be the platform of choice. And that's where your scalability really is tested. You've got to decide, a lot of decisions over here are going to be dependent upon how you build this. So for example, a very simple thing like, what needs to be served with the lowest latency, right? So let's say a profile picture or a profile of a user is something which comes frequently in the game. A lot of places you'll be showing it. That needs to be run off cache. You cannot make a database query which is going to be very expensive in terms of time. Right? For live game, you need to run it off cache. So you need a lot of services which are actually running off your RAM, right? Not running off multiple requests down to the third tier of your architecture. Right? And that's what separates a great infrastructure and a scalable infrastructure from just another one. Right? You need to know where it's going, where that data is going to be served from, how quickly do you need it, how many places will you need it. Right? in the flow of your game. And then you have operations. You need to be able to run this for months together. A multiplayer game has a life much longer than a single player. Right? A typical multiplayer game could last 6 months, a year. Clash of Clans, last August, this is May right now. It's already in its 9th month. So what are the key learnings from all of this? Large studios have the resources. They have invested into server-side engineering skills, infrastructure and operations. They have the money to do all of these things. They also have playbooks. They've built their services as reusable components. I find most small studios reinvent the wheel every single time they build a game. Every game has a custom-built server. It doesn't have to be. You could have reusable services within your architecture. Second is that large studios think of games as a service. They don't think of them as content, as one block, finish, package, and release. Right? They think of it as a service. And thirdly, they make it very flexible. Their entire middleware can be used for the next game, right? A large part of it. So multi-tenancy is one of the key concepts that most of the large studios have got, people like Zeta, right? And that's where we have to get started with how you do it for yourself. So there's a set of tools that you've got to pick, and I'm just going to quickly run through some of the things that you'll use in building your own stack. So front-end tools. How many of you use Unity?
Wow, me too.
Only 3, 4? Only 4? Oh, I heard they had about like 60% market share. So, anyways.
Big lie.
How about Corona?
Yeah, it's there. So I've got Corona here, Corona there. Are you using Corona Cloud?
Yes.
Okay, we'll talk about that more. So you've got to make a choice from here. What's important while making this choice? Anybody here? What's the most important thing when you're making the choice of a tool?
Platforms for me.
Okay, and which is publishing platform. Where does it publish out to? Right? So Unity publishes to almost everything today. Corona does too. Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that is good. Right. Second, I think what is more important than where you can publish out to, I think everybody will support the primary platforms, which is iOS and Android. But you need to be a lot more careful about what services you can integrate with in the backend. Right? If you're building a multiplayer game, right? That's very, very critical. So what kind of support does it have? So certain platforms have some plugins which are available. You can use those plugins. But the plugins update once in a year, maybe. So you don't have extensibility. You don't have new services. Right? If you want corrections, they're not available because they are shipped to everyone. Right? And when it updates, it will update for everyone. So you need some customization. And you need to pick a platform which supports that. So I would suggest you use a platform which supports integration of a very simple RESTful service, which means you just have a simple JSON parser at your end. That's all that is required in these platforms. But some of them are quite difficult to work with. They don't provide this as service. So for example, I know that Game Standard or even Marmalade, Coco Studio also is quite difficult to integrate. Even pure web service, pure RESTful API is difficult to integrate with that. Now what do you build on the server side? This is your server-side stack. I'm not going to talk about operating system and what tools you want to use there, what software you want to use on the stack. But these are your logical components of your server. Right? So I believe you can break it down into 3 kinds of services. There is services which support your client UI. Right? So you have a user profile, a dashboard for a user. You have a lobby system. You have scores. You have leaderboards. And then you have a middleware layer, which is automation, which is not visible directly in the form of UI in the client application, but is very, very critical because it is building all of the stuff that will show in the front end. Right? So if you want to show a lobby and you want to show a social lobby, saying that which of your friends are currently online and playing this game, right? It means that you're actually integrating output from your social graph, the profile of the player, the current time, who's logged in, and who's free to play. Not just logged in. That's not enough. You've got to figure out whether that guy is already inside a game session or not. If he's going to be busy for 15 minutes, you cannot connect to. right? So you need to figure out and maintain that entire presence and availability of a user in your lobby system. You need a session management system which says what happens in a single session. So what is a session? Session is a game session comprising all the players in that session. So if you have a poker table, then it's all the people at the table. You need to decide how many people are going to be at the table. Now this is your back-end logic. This is not front-end logic. Front-end doesn't need to be aware of it. But your back-end needs to be aware of it. Saying that I have a 5 people table or a 9 people table. Right? And I need to route people from the lobby into that session. I need to maintain a single session ID on the server side, which whenever I do a simple get session request, is going to send me whose turn is it right now, which player's turn is it, right? And if it is not my turn, the client should wait and just hold for the next time, right? On a 10-second timer or whatever polling timer you want to set. So different components, like I said, you need timers, that's going to be used here. You need the social graph to figure out the social lobby and then find who's online. This is a very complex process, right? It's a multi-step process which is generating just one simple thing, saying that who's in this session right now, who's playing poker with me, right? You need publishing services which go outside the platform, right? So you need, let's say, to ship new assets in your game to various different builds. There's one way, traditionally, you would update the whole application, send it to Apple for a review again, right? And wait for it to come. You could do it smart. You could do it in a way where you build your client application to get configuration information from your server side and say, hey, do you have any new assets for me? And where do those plug in? So your directory structures can be flexible, can be pre-built, and the application can be available. You can store them on the server. You could ship them for the specific device that you want by keeping device information stored. So these are all parts of profile. So as important as it is to store a user profile, it is as important